Hello everyone, this is Darcinovia here. I am back once again, and this is a new year. And considering how this is a new year, I like to do things a little different regarding my non-fiction reviews. Now, it's been a while since I reviewed a book that isn't a Star Wars novel, and considering the fact that this is, Jesus, I think this is my fifth non-fiction book. Unfortunately, the other two are gone because they were on that other channel. But this is my thoughts, and to give you a reason why I think you should read this book written by Michael Parenti. Now, Michael Parenti, if you have been involved in Marxist circles, you've had to have heard of him at some point. There's no way you haven't. I mean, it'd be like not knowing who Noam Chomsky is or Chris Hedges. Eventually, every Marxist is going to, hear about Michael Parenti. And I make it no secret. I actually am a fan of Michael Parenti. I have been heavily inspired by Michael Parenti. I think his works are easy to understand. I think he's accessible to those who are new into Marxism, and explain it in a way where it's easily digestible and it's understandable. I actually think Michael Parenti should be required reading, in my opinion. If you're a serious Marxist, I think you should be required to read Michael Parenti. Hell, even if you are a detractor of his, I think you should be required to read Michael Parenti, regardless if you agree with his views or not. He is correct in many of his analysis. And if you have paid attention to my Evils of Imperialism playlist, you'll know quite a bit of my videos that I saved have Michael Parenti lectures. Now, those who talk about Michael Parenti will usually recommend to read Black Shirts and Reds. A good book. I recommend everybody to read that one. In fact, I would probably recommend people to read that first before reading this. But I'll talk about Black Shirts and Reds in another video. But for me, history is mystery. Before you read this book, I recommend you get familiar with dialectical and historical materialism. I'd read that by Stalin first. At least get a grasp on dialectics before you read this book. Because this book dives into history and how it's distorted by the ruling class. And unlike mainstream historians, Michael Parenti doesn't pull any punches. He doesn't actually push mythology. He pushes history, asks questions. And I think a good book, especially that talks about these things, is making the reader think about it as they're reading it. Now, I don't consider this light reading. Even though it's easy to read, you could probably get through it within a few days, depending on how well you read and how fast you read and how much you grasp this subject. Now, why do I think this book should it be required reading? Anyone that studies Marxism, Leninism, Maoism is going to understand at some point that a lot of what we know about these leaders that we read about, whether it's Stalin, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Mao, various others, a lot of that history is either distorted or sanitized. And a lot of it is in the hands of mainstream Western historians who go as out of their way to paint dictators, at least in the minds of the West, at least in order to indoctrinate the people of the West, to paint Stalin as a brutal dictator as much as possible and downplay the crimes of people who've committed far worse crimes, such as Wilson Churchill, every U.S. president that, since Truman, and basically gloss them over. And if you read about the history of all of these presidents of America, now if you are British and, you probably would understand what I'm getting at, that the history of these awful, evil people such as Margaret Thatcher and Churchill it's sanitized, completely washed away. And to find any book that is critical of those is very hard. And Michael Parenti gets into detail on what, is acceptable and what isn't. And if these books do, get printed, they become out of print. Or or the ruling class goes out of its way not to promote it. Like, here's an example. The Phoenix program. There was a book about that that was released in the 1990s. That was out of print for decades. It wasn't until like 5 years ago where that book was reprinted. Or Lords of Creation, another book that before it was, accessible to the public again, it was out of print. Or a book that talks about the CIA and the U.S. government recruiting Nazis. Now, you're not going to get all this stuff in the mainstream. You're not going to see that on your bookshelf at a Barnes & Noble. And it's like, that's interesting. What you're going to get is books that are going to glorify the U.S. experiment. You're not going to get anything that's critical. And when you do, one of the few exceptions, like Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States or The Untold History of the United States by Oliver Stone, you're not going to be able to find those in stores. You're going to have to order them online. And I'm just speaking nowadays. Yeah, you could, they're not that difficult to find, but if you're not internet savvy, you're not going to be able to find them unless you order them online or you special order them at a Barnes & Noble. And any book that actually does a more positive view of Stalin, you're not going to be able to find either. Due to the fact that that's not marketable. And if what's not marketable isn't going to be featured in a Barnes & Noble store, or any bookstore for that matter, that's approved by the ruling class. Now, what does this have to do with my review of Michael Parenti's History is Mystery? Because Michael Parenti actually lists examples in history of the ruling class of mainly America, because after all, this is written by an American, how even to this very day, there is still information from the Civil War period. I didn't even know this. That is still suppressed, that it isn't available to the public. Now, what does the ruling class, what are they afraid of? Like, whoever was responsible for all these things they did back then are long dead. It's about controlling, the narrative. And Michael Parenti's book explains this beautifully. Now, these chapters, in the books, in general, they could be read separately. And I think they stand on their own. Because I think it's a great read. And he even goes into detail about, I think my favorite chapter is History and the Faking. And, Ruck's Footsteps. He even talks about the history of historians and how they control the narrative and how, history is used as a propaganda weapon in order to indoctrinate the masses to be for or against social movements. I mean, isn't any wonder why the right now is trying to, all over the country, ban certain books that are critical of the U.S., experiment, or even a more critical view of history? It's all about controlling what we're exposed to. Now, for the past 20 years, we've been getting more non-white historians writing a more critical view of American history, such as Gerard's Home, and I recommend everyone to read this, The Counter-Revolution of 1776. I think if you want to understand the context of, why America is a white supremacist fascist state, I don't think you can go wrong with that book. It's a great place to start if you want to understand America and American culture and why it is the way it is. And you have another book which is written from more of a psychological perspective, which I reviewed this months ago. Frantz Fanon's Wretches of the Earth, I think, is another book, a classic. And of course, you do have a controversial book, at least amongst Marxists, is J. Sakai's Settlers. In fact, to be honest, there's better books you can read. I know you're going to have some people who hate watching this video. Sakaius, whatever childish nonsense you're going to say. I'm bringing this stuff up because history is mystery. I think it's all relevant to this book, because this book talks about various instances in history where the mainstream narrative is pushed above everything else. And there's something I didn't know about that made me think about one of our presidents in this country's history, Zachary Taylor. Like, I didn't even know there was a conspiracy theory about him being assassinated, which is interesting. That chapter is an interesting read, because that could be read on its own, actually. For those of you who are familiar with the JFK assassination, which is, everyone and their mom has heard of that, or discussed it, or thought about it at some point in their lives. And even talks about, the mainstream narrative of trying to continue to reinforce the official mainstream version of history. Now, I think that this book, in my opinion, if you're looking for a different view on history, you should read this. Even if you are critical towards Michael Parenti, even if you're not the biggest fan of Michael Parenti, I do think that this is a book that's going to make you think as you're reading it. And you're going to learn a lot. And it's not a long book. It really isn't. Now, how did I came to discover this book? I'd have to give a shout out to Fellow Traveler, because he did some streams about this book, and I was curious. Based on the title alone, History as Mystery. History is a subject that I'm passionate about, because it fascinates me. And Michael Parenti talks about just how little we don't know about history, because the version that we're exposed to is not written by anyone but the people on top, and those few people who gain access to the archives, the people that aren't white men that do this, we get a drastically different view. Just look at all the books that have been popping up in the past 20 years. Like, I already brought Gerard Holmes' book. There's The Indigenous History of the United States, which I got to read that one of these days. There's so many books. I can't even name them all because there's just too many. There's way too many books. Of course, there's books that were written before, the 2000s regarding, a more critical view on American history. But you've been seeing it more and more. Danny Haifong did a book recently that talked about American exceptionalism and American innocence. Another book I recommend to read that actually, I don't know how anyone could read that book and still give J. Sakai's Settlers shit when that book gets into the same conclusions as that. Now, why am I bringing that up in this review? Because it has something to do about history. And something that grinds my gears about Marxists that have this emotional attachment towards America. If you're gonna, if you don't like Jay Sakai's book, fine. Jay Sakai's book is not a book, for, the weak-minded. If you, are too afraid to actually explore a dark, America, at least learn about a different perspective on American history, there's other books. Gerald Holmes, a much better book. The Counter-Revolution of 1776. That's a book that you should be reading. If you don't want to read Jay Sakai's Settlers, read that one. There's Howard Zinn's, book, The People's History of the United States, which is written from the perspective of the oppressed, not the people on top. There's Danny Haiphong's book, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, which was written towards the final year of the Trump presidency. I think it's a good book. You should read it. You can't tell me that all these books, these ones I'm talking about, don't come to the same conclusions as Jay Sakai did. Now, Jay Sakai's book isn't the greatest, and the only reason I'm bringing this up in that review because it's regarding the subject of history. History is mystery. Michael Parenti talks about history from a critical lens, and it makes you think. It isn't another one of those boring mythological books on history. This book actually makes the reader think the entire time. Now, I don't know how you're going to feel about this book. I don't know if you're going to give it a chance. I think you should. I think every Marxist should read History is Mystery. It's a critical view on history as a whole and a challenge to the mainstream, because the mainstream, how do we know what they write about is true? How do we know? I mean, I'll list another example. JFK. The JFK assassination is one of the most debated conspiracy theories of all time. Most people don't believe in the official version by the government. And I think Michael Parenti makes a similar argument, not by the JFK one, but with Zachary Taylor. That everything, being suppressed and the mainstream historians going out of their way to reinforce the official version. So, if the U.S. government killed John F. Kennedy, what makes you think it wouldn't have killed any other past president? And who's to say they didn't have a hand, possibly, in Abraham Lincoln's assassination? Now, that's a stretch, mind you, but I'm just listing examples of... There's a lot about our own history that we just simply do not know, because a lot of it is still in the archives. Who knows how much history has been basically archived, and who knows how much dirty things the government has been suppressing. Now, there are documents that have been released. And I think there's other books as well that actually talk about this sort of thing. But if you're interested in reading a book that looks at history from a more critical lens, and you want to read something written by a respected Marxist, read this. My reason is, if we're going to understand Marxism, if we're going to look at it as a science, we got to understand history. We got to understand history from a dialectical point of view. And in my opinion, if you're reading this book, read Dialectical and Historical Materialism by Joseph Stalin. Make sure you understand that fully. Make sure you understand other books that talk about the similar subjects, so we can actually reinforce the knowledge you're going to gain from here. Now, this isn't a book that's meant to give you a comprehensive view on history. This book is not even 300 pages, but there's so much information in this book that I actually think it's worth reading at least once. And I recommend reading it with a group of friends. I wish I could have done that, but unfortunately, I have to read this stuff alone, and I'm learning everything pretty much on my own. Anyway, this is Darcenovia, and I hope I sold you on this book. Sorry for my ramblings, but considering that the subject I'm talking about, I feel like it's relevant. Peace out, comrades. May the force be with you, and see you guys next time.